Good evening. Please welcome the President of the Association for Diagnostics and Laboratory Medicine, Dr. Anthony Killeen.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this special session at ADLM 2025. This session is not just about recognition, but about real-world impact. You may have seen an article published in the March issue of the Journal of Applied Laboratory Medicine that explored the outcomes from over 5 years of work from the UNIVANTS of Healthcare Excellence program. The article explored the trends and successful approaches that the teams recognized by UNIVANTS have used to drive measurably better healthcare. As a founding partner of the program, ADLM wanted to bring these stories to you and walk through the insights drawn from integrated healthcare teams around the globe. Today we are putting the spotlight on the UNIVANTS of Healthcare Excellence program, a global collaboration that ADLM is proud to champion. It has been great to see how this program continues to elevate the role of the laboratory in reshaping how healthcare is delivered and making a difference in patient care. For more than 6 years, the UNIVANTS Awards have demonstrated just how remarkable the field of laboratory medicine truly is. In doing so, the program has turned the ambition to improve patient care into evidence. With more than 80 best practices recognized across 32 countries, the program has uncovered measurable improvements for patients, clinicians, healthcare systems, and payors alike. Importantly, these are not theoretical gains. They are backed by data, independently judged, and implemented in real clinical settings. One of the things I admire most about the UNIVANTS of Healthcare Excellence program is its strong emphasis on teamwork. The UNI in UNIVANTS stands for Unifying for Something Greater, and that spirit is really at the heart of the program. It's about bringing multidisciplinary teams together to drive measurably better healthcare, with the lab playing a central role. On this slide, you'll see just a handful of examples, 6 teams from across the globe representing the kind of innovation and impact this program celebrates. In total, nearly 100 sites have been recognized so far. It's a powerful reminder of what's possible when we come together with a shared purpose. I wanted to take the opportunity to also recognize recent winners that were announced in June. The 3 top elite winners from Spain, Japan, and France joined the more than 80 other best practices recognized to date. These 3 teams, along with 6 other 2025 winners, were announced and promoted in a Reflections article in JOM titled, "Healthcare Excellence is a Global Phenomenon." Along those lines, here's a snapshot of the 9 new teams recently inducted into the UNIVANTS of Healthcare Excellence awardees. Congratulations to this year's winners and to any past winners or program champions in the audience. Leaders like you are shaping the future of medicine by delivering measurable, lab-enabled improvements in patient care. There's so much we can learn from each other, which is exactly why sessions like today's are so valuable. Before I hand things over to today's moderator, Dr. Pete Kavsak, I want to thank Abbott for its leadership of this program, and particularly Tricia Ravalico, whose stewardship and passion have been absolutely essential to its success. I would also like to thank the many ADLM members who've contributed to and supported the UNIVANTS program, from serving as expert judges of best practices to advocating for and leading these initiatives yourselves. Your work is helping shift the narrative, showing that the lab is a vital engine of value in improving patient care. Let's keep that momentum going. And with that, please join me in welcoming to the stage Dr. Peter Kavsak.
Thanks so much, Tony. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone. And it's my pleasure to be the moderator for this engaging, electric, and I'll also say fun session because as we all know, learning is fun. Sorry to disappoint folks who thought that I would be a more handsome individual and with a better title. There was some material that was circulated about this session, and it was a very nice picture of someone that wasn't me, and they made me a CEO. So to them, or perhaps to AI, I thank them. I'll be looking forward to perhaps a better raise in the future. So it is my pleasure to introduce folks. That's me on your left. But I'd like to briefly introduce both Christine Schmalzer and Tricia Ravalenko. And I think the thing that's really interesting about Univants is the fact is that what's perhaps really special is that it's a team approach. It's the people. And so I took the opposite of that, and I actually asked my favorite chatbot to write the bios for Tricia and Christine. And this is a test. So if there aren't any questions from the audience, we can ask Christine and Tricia if what the chatbot actually wrote in AI was actually accurate about them. So this is what I did. I asked your AI, quick question, write a short introduction for Tricia and Christine. And then this is what the response was. Here is a concise introduction bios, under 150 words exact. That's amazing. Like, I didn't even have to ask the chatbot. I wanted, they did it. So Tricia Ravalenko is a global diagnostics leader serving as Director of Global Scientific Leadership and Education in Abbott's Core Diagnostic Division. And even provided a reference. Fantastic. She is the founder and executive lead of the UNIVANTS of Healthcare Excellence Award Program, established to amplify and celebrate laboratory-enabled clinical best practice worldwide. Another citation, we're 2 for 2. With nearly 3 decades of experience, Tricia has had leadership roles in R&D, scientific affairs, clinical trials, and marketing across Abbott, overseeing 65+ global clinical studies and holding several patents in assay technology and sample carryover. So that's very impressive. She also serves as executive board of the International Federation of Clinical Chemistry and Laboratory Medicine and has chaired key working groups, including the IFCC Task Force on Cardiac Biomarkers. So everyone took note of that, and if there's no questions, we can ask Tricia at the end about what was true and what was perhaps not true in that bio. Now to Christine. So Christine is an associate professor of pathology at Case Western Reserve University and division chief of clinical pathology, vice chair of systems pathology operations, and medical director of point of care testing at the University Hospitals Cleveland Medical Center. That is a mouthful, so she must be an important person. So that's true. Okay, she earned a BA in biochemistry and chemistry and her MD at Case Western, followed by an anatomic and clinical pathology residency and a molecular genetic pathology fellowship at Emory University. Her clinical focus and research interests include laboratory test utilization, pediatric pathology, molecular diagnostics, and education for trainees and public. She was instrumental in expanding UH's capacity to develop and validate in-house diagnostics where no FDA-approved assay existed. So then you must be also asking, well, what's the connection between all 3 of us? So I asked, my favorite chatbot this question. What is the connection between Tricia, Christine, and Pete? Well, here's how Tricia, Christine, and Pete are, well, they said Dr. Peter, and then they put in quotes, Pete, which I thought was pretty neat of a chat program. Anyways, are professionally connected. 1, shared affiliation with the Univants of Healthcare Excellence, and 2, roles within laboratory-enabled healthcare initiation. And most importantly, this AI program also did a summary in that they said all 3 leaders intersect through the Univants award ecosystem. I think that's a fantastic word, ecosystem. So it keeps with our theme today about exciting, electric, and it's part of an ecosystem that we're building here. And they say where, first bullet, Tricia shapes and oversees the initiative. 2, Christine leads and participates in award-winning lab initiative clinical teams. And 3, and Pete contributes expert scientific content and perspective as a distinguished speaker and domain authority. So you know that's not true. So that's one thing that we know the ChatGPT got wrong. So again, and I think it kind of highlights the fact is AI is very good, but we still need humans. And I like to give a couple of human thoughts, or what I call HT here. So Christine, I find it was remarkable, and the fact is that she not only practices, she publishes in almost every discipline of laboratory medicine. So if you think of that, and you think of an individual, that is exactly what we call a laboratory professional who actually has content, expertise, and training in all those areas, which is truly remarkable. And I've known Tricia for a long time, and I think there's something called COVID that we all experience. And so I kind of think now of time frames as BC or before COVID. But in this case, I'll do my time with Tricia as BU. And for all the chemists out there, no, it's not bilirubin unconjugated, it's before UNIVANTS, where Tricia did an amazing job on a lot of projects to really propel the field of diagnostic industry. But if we think what's happened after UNIVANTS, or AAU, I think the symbol speaks of itself, AAU being gold. And it's just been golden, and this initiative that they had with UNIVANTS has really raised the lab profile, which is what we really need in today's world. Okay, so we do have faculty disclosures. They're listed here. I'd be happy to talk about how, I want more of these, but anyways, they're listed there. The next thing that's really important is that this session has accent credit, which is fantastic, and it's 1.5, and so please claim your credit by going to the site and registering. So that's important, and then the thing about that that's been great is it's a free program. So the learning objectives is kind of briefly touched upon with Tony's great introduction, but I'm just gonna emphasize the fact is that at the end of this session, you're going to recognize the critical role of laboratories in closing care gaps. And that's great. And really, we need these care gaps to be closed to really benefit patients. Yeah, providers, payors, sure, health systems. Yeah, they're all important. There's 4 key stakeholders, but I think patients are the most important. Then they're going to actually navigate common challenges. And that's important, because if you're going to try to do an initiative, you need to actually circumvent what the challenges are. And the third thing is, after you do that, can you actually apply some proven strategies to improvements in this area, in this realm? So very important objectives, which I hope at the end of the session, everyone will be able to leave with some tangible takeaways. So with that, I'd also like everyone to download the app, or there's another word, engage with the E. I feel like this is a Sesame Street episode sponsored by the letter E, because it's really an excellent symposium, and we want people to engage. So please download the app, add in your questions. We'll try to answer them in the Q&A at the end of the sessions, but there'll be some polling as well, and that we'd like to see people start, because we want an engaging session. So with that, the first question we have is, how familiar are you with the UNIVANTS of Healthcare Excellence Award Program? There's 3 choices, and they all have aware in them. I can't read anything else. Okay, so with that, we're loading. The best part, it gets to red, so your blood pressure should be rising if you haven't put in your selection yet. Oh, and then there's a relief. This is fantastic. So thank you very much for coming to this session, because we really want to change that not aware to be aware after the session. And if we do that, I think we've exceeded our goals of this. So thank you very much, and we're looking forward to some great questions at the end as well. So just to kind of provide a little better framework, and again, Tony alluded to this in his introduction, that there's actually 4 criteria that's needed as judges will assess for eligibility. The first one is the clinical care initiative must be implemented in clinical practice. And obviously that's an important criteria. The clinical team must include at least 3 disciplines, obviously 1 being lab, but that's that human team approach. And I think that's what really makes UNIVANTS a very special award program. The application must be free of bias, i.e. no reference to specific products. And you have to have KPIs associated, or key components indicators, to each of the 4 stakeholders, patients, clinicians, health systems, so forth. Finally, the impact has to be measurable, right? And that's really good. In the lab, we do that all the time. We measure things. We measure them well, we measure them not that well. The point is we can measure them. So the impact has to be measurable. It has to be quantitative or qualitative. And the most important thing that's listed in red at the bottom, it has to be linked to health benefit. Because other than that, then why are we doing anything? And lastly, this is, again, remember there's a little bit about the ChatGPT, sorry, I said my favorite AI program. One other connection I have, which again, the program didn't pick up, is that I'm a proud team member of a group that was awarded a distinction award, and so I'm proud to be an alumni of the UNIVANTS of Healthcare Excellence. And, oh, well, thank you very much. So the next hour, I'll just talk about that award if that's okay with everyone. No, okay, no. So with that, I'd like to, these are our two speakers and their topics, and I don't want to take up any more of their time. I'm going to ask Tricia to come out here and give her electric talk.
Okay, hello. I want to start by just doing a shout out to ADLM for hosting this session. Mark Golden, the CEO, had a vision to do education around a recent paper that we published as early as February of this year. And then Dennis Harris, who's been instrumental in helping facilitate this event today. The other shout out I want to do is to my co-author on the paper, Dr. Colleen Strain. She's in the audience. We both run from the scientific angle UNIVANTS and have the privilege of reviewing best practices in healthcare medicine that are happening all across the globe. And often we do educational talks on, or lead educational sessions on the best practices themselves. But once we started to have about 5 years of data, we started to have scale. And so we could look at the data differently and not just take it from a standpoint of what is the best practice, but what can we learn from those best practices in the space of laboratory medicine, and what is it teaching us? And so we used the data from, and so we mentioned, I think Tony mentioned that there's nearly 85 best practices to date. Many of you in the audience may have some association to at least one of those best practices. The best practices that were fueled for this specific paper represent the last 5 years. So we just recognized 6 years. The 7th cycle starts at the end of this week, so August 1st. But you can see the data that I'm going to be presenting today are from 72 best practices across the countries and the entities that you see on this graph right here. And I'm going to be walking through 10 insights that we found electric and really moving and insightful as it relates to what can we learn from these as it relates to laboratory medicine, and what does that tell us what to do next? And thereafter, Christine's going to come up and give tangible examples associated with some of the key trends that she sees, and then we'll open it up for discussion. And I think it's important to remember that, again, these insights and trends that we're highlighting are derived from the UNIVANTS program, but are not necessarily about UNIVANTS, but laboratory medicine and healthcare on the quest for healthcare excellence. Okay, so let's start with something that I think, while I don't think this is necessarily insightful conceptually, because we celebrate the value of laboratory medicine and we know how important laboratory medicine is to healthcare, this is really nice evidence to highlight how that actually translates from the program to where we make the biggest impact. So you heard Pete talk about, in order to get recognized with a UNIVANTS of Healthcare Excellence Award, you have to show a measurable impact to patients, payors, clinicians, and health systems or entire health ecosystems. And so here you can see the plethora of different disease areas where existing proven best practices exist. You can see trends year over year. So we see cases very regularly in cardiology and infectious disease. We separated COVID out since that's a bit different, but we all know, and we don't want to underestimate, the role that laboratory medicine had in the era of the pandemic. But here you can see, and actually this was published in February. Just recently, we actually published an update in Modern Healthcare, adding year 6. And so here again, you see that cardiac and infectious disease have a direct correlation to measurably better healthcare performance outcomes in terms of the number of submissions that we see. But you can also see key areas, and I think if you heard from Tony, some of the two top winners this year were in the space of neurology. And so we're seeing an increase in various adoptions of either new processes, new tests in different disease areas that are making a measurable difference. Now, the quantity of cases doesn't necessarily always relate to the quality of cases that get submitted. So within the tiers of UNIVANTS, we do have different levels of distinction. And so I did want to highlight this because, and this is unpublished, but it's still, I thought, insightful. which shows that regardless of the fact of the frequency of best practices that we see in the space of cardiology and infectious disease, women's health, and so forth, here you can see that the top performing best practices each year span even more than the, few that I'm highlighting here. Okay, so the next question we get is, we say lab-enabled best practices. How did laboratories actually enable or fuel that best practice? And this leads us to my first polling question. So I'll just share what those options are, and then we'll get to the live poll. So this is the role that laboratory medicine plays in the lab-enabled best practice across the disease states that we just looked at. So A would be new assays, B would be new algorithms or digital health solutions, C would be new processes, and D is lean and Six Sigma performance. Okay, fascinating. So just to recap what I'm seeing here is that many of you believe new assays represent more than the unfair share of lab-enabled best practices, followed by digital health solutions, lean Six Sigma performance, and then least was new healthcare processes. Okay, let's go and see. That's good. That tells me many of you haven't read the paper yet, which I think is good. Many of you also don't know much about UNIVANTs, which I think is a huge opportunity as well. So we mapped that, which is where did lab medicine play? And I think your perception, which is that it was 50% new assays, is very similar to payer perception, which is that we're always about adding new tests. And I think you could see new tests play a major role in lab-enabled best practices and almost represent a quarter, regardless of the year, both collectively and individually, in terms of how lab medicine does play a role in measurably better healthcare. As my other hat is being part of a diagnostic company, and we're always looking for what are those new test methods and how are they driving advancements in clinical care pathways. But notice everyone thought last was healthcare new processes. And I will say, if there's a new test method, it usually does drive a new process. But I think it's very optimistic to show that actually implementation of new processes, optimizing the processes that we have today without implementing a new algorithm or a new test, represents 50% of most of the best practices that get submitted and recognized through the Healthcare Excellence program each year. And then here on the left-hand side, you see huge opportunities, because we know digital health plays a massive role in how we start looking at longitudinal analysis of data, a cadence in terms of interpretation and moving data from insights, and on average, it represents its unfair share of the collective whole. Now this also is unpublished, the previous slide is in the paper. I did take a cross look and say, okay, if we looked at the collective whole, which is the blue, and then said, what about those top performing best practices, meaning those that actually were in the highest tier of recognition? And so here you can see that back to new processes, not only does it represent in quantity the total number of cases we see, but it also represents its unfair share and about 50% of the best practices we see. And I think this is a nice call to action to all of us to reflect upon how we as laboratorians can actually change processes without even necessarily doing much other than talking to one another, reaching out for the unifying for something greater piece, and assessing where we can play a different role in enabling new processes or driving a cadence to those processes to achieve measurably better healthcare. And the other thing we can see, which is very optimistic from a digital health perspective, is those few cases that actually have been recognized or are submitted actually represent their unfair share of the top elite winners. And so I think that highlights a very neat opportunity to start leveraging this strength. And of course, new test methods will always be important to us, and I think that's why it represents 51% of your guests today. Okay. So insight number 3, and this was a fun analysis a little subjective, so it did require a bit of interfacing with some of the, the sites that get recognized, but it was looking at the power of cross-disciplinary collaboration. And so every best practice, by definition of being part of the UNIVANTS program, involves multidisciplinary teams, right? Laboratory medicine with at least 2 other stakeholders, pharmacy, ER, nursing, IT, emergency medicine, whatnot, as part of the criteria for the submission, okay? And so what you have here is, again, the role that laboratory medicine played, where if it was a lab-led initiative, and then how laboratories actually played a part in that care initiative. So was it transactional or was it leadership? Okay, and we have physician applications because, again, this is a healthcare award. It's not a laboratory award, okay? But these are lab-enabled best practices. And then here, horizontally, you can see how do we actually segregate or kind of highlight sort of the tiers of the awards. So the larger circles represents the highest tier. And so I think this picture really nicely illustrates the opportunities that exist for, one, cross-disciplinary collaboration to achieve the most quantitative, measurable outcomes associated with key performance indicators for patients, payers, clinicians, and health systems. And it really highlights the importance of, when we say getting out of the lab, to making sure that labs, which have in many cases insightful information that can drive new healthcare processes, and translate that into value to the health system. And every clinical care case that we'll be talking about today, including the direct examples that Christine will provide, will go through that quite nicely. Okay, so now this is my last polling question, but it's one of my favorites, and it's mostly because I didn't want to give the answer to this question, since I found this to be one of my most favorite insights of the paper, relates to the value of these care practices and the quantification of key performance indicators. Okay, so the question is, knowing that every best practice has to have at least one measurable key performance indicator for each of these different stakeholders, and looking at the collective whole of all 72, what do you think is the most common stakeholder that's associated with the most best practices? Okay? So let's go ahead and see your answer to that one. Okay, excellent. Well, first of all, hell yeah, because I'm looking at this and it says that 43% of you believe that it's patients. 27% say clinicians, another 25% for health systems, and really rightfully so, not rightfully so, but certainly challenging, and we'll speak to that in the paper, is payors. Okay, so that's great, because many of us associate laboratory medicine in the basement. We even had questions when we got back from the reviewers of this paper that was saying, oh, it's so difficult to actually quantify the value to patients, right? But here you can see, now patients represent the I guess I would say, light blue entity here, and whether or not we're looking at the total number of KPIs, the total number of quantitative KPIs, or the relationship of the quantitative KPIs to the qualitative KPIs, or heck, even just the diversification across the categories, patients had a statistically significant difference in favor of patients relative to all the other 3 stakeholders. And I think this underscores something that we know very well, which is we have a direct relationship to patient care. And it sort of changes, hopefully, our mindset as it relates to the power of what we do. The other thing I'd like to share here is it has one of the highest, again, ratios of quant to qual. And I think that's really important, because a key piece on how we measure value relates to how can we communicate that value. And in the program, and I think this is going to be important, particularly as we get to the next stakeholder, is we can measure quantitative value, and part of that is measured here, right? What are the things that we measure for patients? We measure safety. We can measure wellness, right? These are all KPIs, and if they're in the royal blue versus the navy, they're actually quantitative. So there's quantitative examples of how lab-enabled best practices increase wellness, improve patient satisfaction, right? Improve length of stay. And you can see there's other ones as well. There's also qualitative. And I think this is important. If you come up with a new accelerated diagnostic pathway for patients that present to the emergency room with chest pain, and suddenly their wait time isn't 6 hours or 12 hours, it's 2 hours, right? Sometimes the value to that patient beyond time can't be measured because the patient doesn't know that it might be 6 hours, right? So if you have an emergency medicine physician advancing care, triaging, or at least telling that patient that they're not having a heart attack, and that timeline is reduced from 6 hours to 2, we know there's an improvement or a reduction in anxiety for that patient, which is a soft metric or something that can be captured qualitatively. And I mention that because there's plenty of examples of stigmatism, whether or not a patient feels like targeted for opt-out programs and so forth, and we can discuss those types of measurements in the Q&A section. Okay, so I think many of you thought clinicians were number 2, right, in terms of the total number of total KPIs across all the best practices that got submitted. It might interest people to know, and I found this one to be not just insightful, but actionable, which is how do we measure our value to clinicians, and how have even the best of the best measured that value? So on the far right, you see that how they've measured that value is more qualitatively than quantitatively, okay? And in fact, if we put that as a ratio and say, okay, looking at all the stakeholders, how many times does qualitative outweigh quantitative? Well, you can see based even directionally, only one direction and only one stakeholder, clinician, right? So the recipient of laboratory medicine is the clinician, yet we have the hardest time measuring the value of what we produce from the core lab to the clinician, right? And I think this has a lot to do with our identity crisis, which is why we called it the chicken and egg conundrum. And I think it enables us to think differently on how we should be measuring that value, not just qualitatively, but quantitatively. And I know we, Univants, and we, Abbott, have a lot to say in that area. But in the interest of time, I'm going to swing through these insights, and then I'm sure we'll have some discussion later. Okay, so I know many of us know that, and we've probably all heard it, right? And it's the reason why we celebrate Lab Week. It's the reason why we talk about value, is because every time we introduce a new test or order a new test, it's sometimes, especially depending on what type of cost model we're talking about, we start thinking about how much that costs, right? And in many cases, it could be seen as a cost center to the health system. And one of the things that I find really happily intriguing is if we took the health system as an entity or as a stakeholder and then tried to look at, well, what is it telling us as it relates to the key performance indicators, or at least the top 5 quantitative key performance indicators that we have in the category of health system and administration, this is what we see. Okay, so outside the 33% that is related to some type of improvement in reputation, which may have some costs, but let's, for the sake of this discussion, assume it doesn't, we can see that 67% actually relate to ways in which the laboratory of medicine or the lab-enabled best practices drive value for the overall health system, right? And even in the category of enhanced resource utilization, you could see very specific ways in which that value can be measured, right? Is it measured based on staffing because you've automated something and something doesn't require the same type of full-time employees? Is it based on therapeutic intervention because now you're doing different dosing because of a different method for how in which eGFR is calculated? Is it about bed occupancy or throughput through the ED? Is it about not utilizing CT scans? So you can see that there is different ways to measure value as it relates to a higher health ecosystem. And the neat thing about this data is it's highlighting the exact opposite as what we always find ourselves in the defense, which is that we're not cost drivers to the health system. Okay, Insight 7 says something that I think just based on the output that many of you said, and I think this does make sense, which is where do we have the hardest time measuring value, right? So if I mention this is based on 72 best practices, and you can see the total number reflects judge-validated key performance indicators associated with each across those 72. So I think the cool thing is, even though we need at least 72 or at least 1 per case to be in the payer category, we have examples of best practices that far exceed the minimum criteria for the award, which would have been 72, right? The other thing you can start to see is that we have less options, right? You know, in terms of how we actually prove value to a payer, there's not as many KPIs as we saw 29 different ones in the case of a payer. In the case of patient. And I think that creates another opportunity, and I think there should be a lot of education in this space, because sometimes it's actually hard to measure, particularly when we're talking about the space of wellness, is how do we actually measure the absence of event, the prevention of event for something that you're saving, right? And I think, you know, in our space, especially with all the new tools and the opportunities, we can learn from the best practices that exist and start quantifying that value differently for a new value stream. And I think if I could do an aside, one of my favorite opportunities, having, you know, awarded and been part of a lot of recognition for the sites that have been awarded, this area and really the recognition of having a best practice where you invest and have laboratory medicine with that seat at the table, playing a major role on the integrated clinical care team in such a way that it drives a best practice, basically earns more finances coming into the lab, and it also earns more conversations where lab-enabled insights can actually help in other areas. And we have nice examples of that as well if you want to get into it in the Q&A. Okay, insight 8. You know, there's different ways of measuring value, right? There's one showing how great we are, right, to the health system or to the patient. It's very difficult to show the opposite in our space, right? Because you can't hold back the power of laboratory medicine and the importance of laboratory medicine to say, hey, without us, you would not be as good or you wouldn't be in the best situation. But the cases can, right? Because there's anomalies and there's things that happen, right, that relate to things. You know, we had one in the case of the Ukraine where the war actually created a circumstance where valuable test results couldn't be provided to you know, a healthcare system that relies heavily on that existence, right? We've had other examples where, you know, laboratory test results exist, but don't exist at the time of which some surgery is going to be presented, and it delays care. Okay, there was a Russia best practice in that case. And in this one, I chose to highlight one from Palestine because I think it's one that very much resonates because many of us are focused on the quality of care. And in this case, particularly in emerging markets where you have unreliable test results, you could see this downward spiral, right? So if you have unreliable test results, will physicians trust them? Will they send them out? Will that cause more delays? Is that causing a reduction in care? And you see this downward spiral. Okay, and then this leader across this health system who is dealing with substantial, you guys can all imagine what would happen to any of us if we had and were living in this type of health system, this other trajectory where suddenly through a quality process, they were able to improve the quality of results, which enhanced that trust, which in turn enabled not only ordering patterns to change, but also, you know, in this case, reference labs and others opting into this site, and they actually increase those metrics. So I think that's really exciting as well. And I think, you know, another key trend that we were hoping to validate with this slide or with this data was this movement towards prevention, right? We all know, and in many cases, lab medicine thrives in that, you know, kind of transactional approach of, okay, a sick patient comes in and they need a diagnosis, and laboratory medicine helps drive what that means. But we also know that if we're trying to focus on wellness and we're trying to actually take a step back from the transactional care and earn that seat at the table and start predicting illness and actually kind of, you know, some people call it the pre-patient consumer, right? Get it to patients before they're patients. You know, what does that paradigm look like? And do we see that in the trends for the healthcare excellence as well? And so here you can see, if we looked at, again, by year, all the best practices, or at least the quantitative measure percentage-wise of every best practice as a function of prevention, acute care, and chronic care. And so this was a little disappointing for us, but it just tells us, in our opinion, that it's not to say that prevention is not a focus area. It's to say that there's still opportunity, and perhaps it's lagging behind just like guidelines sometimes lag behind traditional innovative standard of care, because it does take time to measure those outcomes, get recognized for those outcomes, and so forth. So we looked at the data both as a percentage and as a absolute, and even though we see a spike in the COVID year, even the spike within COVID, where we were focused on acute care diagnoses, it wasn't statistically significant. So I think it makes sense that we see a bit of variation here and there. Okay, I'm going to get to my 10th one now, and then pass it over to Christine. This last one speaks to the importance of workshops like these. Every year we get applications that are disqualified, some even before we get to judge review. And a huge piece of that is maybe people not paying attention to the criteria, but another piece of that is have we done enough? And when I use that term we, I'm using it in the space of laboratory medicine. How skilled are we at measuring the value of what we do outside of laboratory medicine? So we're not talking about turnaround time, but we're talking about health system, patient, and payer key performance indicators. What do they look like? How do we measure it? Who do we need to get involved? How do we validate it? And how can we quantify that? And I think that's an important piece in terms of how we speak the same language. And we've had top winners of the program that talked about how their business case for their one program had 12 years of rejections through the health system simply because they weren't getting the funding that they needed. And then whether it was articulated differently or whether or not there were other extenuating circumstances, once it did, it won the top prize. Because many of us have ideas that we know once we implement, we can make a measurable difference. And if we focus on those ideas, work together, leverage the best practices that exist, welcome new best practices, have the right people engaged on your team, we can make an even larger difference. And so I'm really excited about that. And the other thing I'm excited about, 78% or 75% of the audience here is in the United States. I wanted to put this because it really highlights where are the best practices coming from. You saw that on one of my first slides, which was the United States plays a massive role, and you could see that with their unfair share here as well. Okay, so with that, I have a lot more I could say, but I'm going to pass the floor to Christine because she's going to take us through some representative examples, and she represents the program not just as a past winner, but also as somebody who has served as a judge for the program, which is, I think, very, very exciting. So with that, I'm going to pass it to Christine.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much, Tricia, for walking through those fabulous trends. As she shared, I'm going to transition to talking about some ignition tactics or principles that you can use to develop these things in your own organization. And through this, we're going to use best practice examples highlighted from the various UNIVANTS winners over the years. I want to emphasize that our goal here today is not just to inspire you to consider submitting to the UNIVANTS program, but importantly, how you can make change and apply these principles in your own organization. So we'll go through these 5 ignition tactics, starting with diversification of the specialties. So we start here thinking about what is working well. As Tricia showed, the graph of the different specialties represented, there's about a dozen or more specialties there, but there were 3 of them that accounted for over 50% of the submissions and the winners. They're listed here: cardiology, COVID-19, infectious diseases. So when I started to look at these, thinking about, well, what might have contributed to the success of these, and these being more enriched in those submission categories. So when we look at this, I was thinking of things like, these might be areas where you have more defined, clear, laboratory-based clinical guidelines already available. Or, in the case of COVID-19 on steroids, the initiative is of a priority to the health system. So there's a lot of things we want to do in the lab. When it's under our control, we can do it. But when it involves others outside of the lab, sometimes it takes it being an institutional priority for it to get attention. And lastly, some places clinical and laboratory partnerships already exist, and that may make it easier to get things off the ground. So as I walk through the examples, I'm going to give you an example of where some of these principles may already have been in place, and others where it might have been a little harder to get these things going, and how some of these winners or awards of distinction or other use these tools to make progress and have impact. So I'll start here with this project from the University of Kansas Health System. So this group focused on C. diff testing. So as we all know, if I look back at those 3 pieces that might contribute to easier success or a lower activation energy for success, C. diff is a priority to the organizations. All healthcare organizations want decreased infections, improved antibiotic stewardship, and they are judged on it. And they are judged publicly, and dollars, real dollars, are attached to this. Additionally, there are clear guidelines, but those guidelines need a lot of discussion with some groups outside of the laboratory. And this is also a place where laboratory and clinical partnerships already exist. So we have infection control committees everywhere. We have antibiotic stewardship committees that exist everywhere. So these pieces together make it something that's tangible to get started doing. So this group brought that together, had discussions about implementation of appropriate testing methods with a multidisciplinary group, and achieved tremendous outcomes, as you can see here. So these, again, highlighting there were partnerships already in place. There were institutional, financial, and reputational incentives that were prioritizing this to the organization. And the guidelines require interdisciplinary action. So this group successfully achieved those outcomes. So when we think about other areas, so that kind of right end of the curve of specialties that were submitted to the UNIVANTS program, how can we enrich for things that may not have those pieces already so easily in place? So this is where we're in an audience of chemists, an audience of scientists, so we have to lower the activation energy. And so here are some tools to suggest to do that, is utilize existing committees. So where do committees exist that you're involved in that might not be as prominent, or that exist but the lab isn't at the table for those? Seek out newly published guidelines, so it's an opportunity to start talking about something that needs implementation. Look for those incentives. What's important to the organization? Is it length of stay? Is it throughput through the ED? Where can you as the lab contribute to things that are important, not just in the lab, but outside? And importantly, go where the passion is. So seek passionate partners. These partners can lead to progress. And passion comes in multiple forms. Sometimes passion is positive and people are very enthusiastic about their specialty, and sometimes passion can be a little bit negative. So who is bringing you the concerns? Who is sharing their complaints? And get them on your side, and you may be able to get something successful done. So this example here, this is a 22 award of distinction that I was a part of this team, and colleagues from my organization, where we were focused on improving the drug testing for controlled substance prescriptions. In Ohio at that time, there was a substantial increase in fatalities due to opioids. It was a very high visibility in our organization, but there was a lot of questions on how to fold laboratory testing into this. So we pulled together a lot of partners to help them understand how to use tests, design testing that met their needs, that answered their questions, and get education out there around it. So we did this by, again, looking for the committees. There were institutional guidelines and committees out there, but lab had not been a deep part of it. So that's an opportunity. So we have to think about it as an opportunity to insert ourselves. It was definitely a regional priority in our area, and we had a lot of passion in our partners. This controlled substance prescribing brings a lot of risk to our providers as well as patients. And so through incorporation of the testing into there, we could help balance that. And we did have some complaints, and so that helped guide what does our test panel need to look like? What education do we need to provide? So moving on to the next tactic, focusing on the process. As Tricia shared, and I appreciated the poll that this was a less picked item, is focusing on the process. Now, I'm one here that at my organization, I often say, somebody needs to care about the glucose. Somebody needs to care about the sodium. I have worked on the molecular testing side, but the reality is that it's not always the newest and most interesting thing that has impact. But whether it's new or old, whether it's guidelines that exist or not, putting a governed process in place to make sure that the best practice actually gets implemented and actually gets carried out is where a lot of the money is. And it always takes a bit of a spark of creativity. So again, giving two examples, one with lower activation energy and one that needs the activation energy lowered. This example here is from Kaiser Permanente in California. So their goal was, we have lipid guidelines. We have treatment guidelines surrounding LDL cutoffs. These are not new. There's been discussion around those about statin prescription, but they found that they were not having sufficient statin prescription in compliance with the guidelines. And again, these are non-controversial guidelines. These are things that are already in place. Physicians know what to do with these results, but yet it wasn't being done consistently. So their approach was using governed processes, putting in electronic health record-directed algorithms that directed the treatment and moved the treatment needle along with this and saw substantial impact and outcomes. Stepping a little bit further away from to a little more challenge was from the 2021 top winner from the Croydon University Hospital in England. So this group was focusing on increasing HIV diagnosis and thus improving and impacting care. If you think back to a decade or so ago, this was opt-in testing for HIV. There's substantial stigma around both the testing and the diagnosis. And there was a lot of studies showing that there was underdiagnosed HIV, and that any point of care where a patient enters into a system is an opportunity for diagnosis. But the current processes weren't working. So this group needed to get a little bit creative and switch to an opt-out, lowering the stigma with testing, making it part of a routine testing, and making it embedded in the processes of care. So with this, they were able to have substantial increase in improvement on patient care through switching to that opt-out process. So with this group was attentive to the changing guidelines. So not just the guidelines, but the new push of how we look at these things. They thought creatively about how to achieve the goal. While not as directly institutionally important, but it's tremendously important for public health in any area. And so they put a governed process in place to ensure that this best practice happened. So the next one I want to talk about is building out-of-lab bridges. So we impact everybody, as we know. I have people ask me, do you see patients? And I said, well, no, but yes, I see all of the patients. So we in the lab, we have all kinds of patients coming through. We work with everybody across the system. And we need to partner with them to engage and put activities and have substantial impact on practice. So I want to highlight two examples here. So the first one, this is Pete's, our moderator Pete, or CEO Pete, however we want to refer to him here. This was his group in Hamilton in Canada. When Tricia shared a graph of the stakeholders that were involved in the projects, and that some that had physician stakeholders and a leadership capacity in the projects had success. And so this is where we've got to have a bit of humility here. So this project had excellent lab leadership engaged in this who understood troponin, understood the power of troponin, but needed a passionate surgeon of thinking of how they can apply that in advance of non-cardiac surgeries to assess the risk of a patient undergoing any non-cardiac surgery for outcomes afterwards. So this passionate physician-surgeon partner was able to work with this group, and they actually did a risk calculator, which again, that's going to be a higher activation energy to get a group sophisticated enough to have the power to have a risk calculator. But having this partnership together makes it effectively work. So another one, so troponin, surgeons, all those things are very prominent. But there is work to be done even in I would call them less visible areas. So this is another winner of achievement, a team of achievement from my organization that was looking at H. pylori. So this group, we have the molecular testing capabilities to develop a resistance testing algorithm for H. pylori. They have pharmacists knowing there's an increased resistance in clarithromycin. We have patients not getting prescribed the right drug. And so there was chatter amongst the GI physicians, the pharmacists, our lab. We had initially developed this assay, the members of this team, but it wasn't increasingly used. So they put a governed processes around it to have it reflex off of the formalin tissue for any new H. pylori diagnosis. So every patient got consistent care. We had an ability to detect the frequency of resistance in the area, and we had great success. So why was this group successful? So this was, again, reacting to a nationally growing challenge that's of importance to passionate partners. So when you think of GI, you think a lot of colon cancer and those sorts of things, but there's a lot of patients suffering from H. pylori gastritis. They engage both clinical physician leaders and pharmacists in theirs as well. And again, pharmacists, when we think of antibiotic stewardship, it's a lot of the inpatients. It's a lot of some of those, but this is a niche area within infection prevention and stewardship pharmacy that can be pulled in and implemented a governed process. So the next piece I want to cover is defining and delivering data. So data is both powerful and sometimes a little bit the bane of our existence. And so when we look at this, for having a successful demonstration of outcomes, it's really important to define your data strategy in advance. So think of data as a routine part of developing and implementing any process or practice that you want to do. Easier said than done, but we'll walk through some of these examples of how you might approach it. So first is to think about your goal. So you want to define goal-oriented data. So as you know, again, scientists in the room, anytime you would go to a statistician or anybody else, like, well, what's the question you're asking? So you always need to ask, what is the question we're asking? And then at that time, what data might support the assessment of the outcomes you are trying to demonstrate? Not what data will demonstrate the positive outcome you want, but what data will effectively assess it. And so you need to think about will qualitative data be best suited for this case? Will quantitative data be best suited? The examples here, as we go through them, the first one from the group in Taiwan was looking at increases in access to transplant. So we have it listed here in the qualitative category. Clearly, an outcome measure for that can be measuring the number of increase or change in the number of people eligible for transplant. But the quotes are powerful as well. So this is a quote from a hospital saying their patients are feeling and physicians are feeling satisfied that they are now able to get their patients more access. When we look at the two clinician buckets here, as Tricia showed, it can be hard to demonstrate quantitative outcomes for clinicians. And this is where, again, pre-thinking about how you want to capture that, what is your goal, how might you measure it is important. So I have two examples here, and neither better than the other. These are just different examples that we're using. So the first example in the middle is qualitative data for clinicians. The other is quantitative about the same topic. So what's important to clinicians? We have to get in their heads. A lot of the time in the EMR, it's important to decrease the clicks. It's decreasing the pajama time. It's making their job more efficient. So in the first example, we have a qualitative assessment of this is freeing up valuable time by having patients, only the more complex patients come for a physician visit. With pre-planning and thinking this through, you can measure that quantitatively. It might take access to the EMR, it might take some other data, but how many physical minutes or how many fewer clicks were done in a particular project? The other piece in thinking of your data strategy is to source non-lab data. And so I have a list here on the left of a variety of aspects of non-lab data. You might look at these and say, I don't know how to access these. I don't have access to those. Or you might be like, oh yeah, I have a good friend in that area. I know the person to ask there. But thinking it through, pulling these stakeholders in, building those bridges outside of your lab can access more data, but it's better served when done up front in the planning versus at the back end be like, hey, maybe we should check that because you can set up your project more effectively in the beginning. So two examples here. So the first one is from a group in Russia that they were looking at the impact of biomarker or test assessment in advance of surgeries, so pre-surgical testing, and that they weren't getting as much, it wasn't as consistently getting done. So when you think about data there, it can be a lower activation energy measure to look at the increase in the number of markers that are done. Important, so how many more patients are accessing that care? But a higher activation energy level marker is to look at the unplanned surgical cancellations. That speaks to hospital operations. Like they want those ORs to be used, they don't want them to be empty. So planning to think of, well, what data matters for my goals outside of the laboratory in advance may help you make that story. The second one is from a group in Malaysia, which is looking at reducing patient and payer costs. So we talk a lot about impact to the dollars of healthcare, but planning on measuring that, planning the time that you need to look at to actually measure it versus predict what it would look like or estimate what it would look like. Both of those are powerful. Estimates are useful, but to actually calculate and measure the dollars takes some upfront planning. The next one is linking value across stakeholders. So when we look at the UNIVANTS program, as Tricia and Pete shared, that you can have only one data measure applied to one stakeholder. You can't apply that same data measure across stakeholders. But where we live in our laboratories, you can apply that data measure to as many people as you want. But you have to tell it to different people in different ways. That same measure may speak to people differently. So the example here is length of stay. And again, this means something to patients, to physicians, to hospital operators, to payers, all of those things. So we have two examples here. The first one from Spain, which was looking at length of stay in the emergency department. They had about a 4-hour reduction in length of stay for evaluation for traumatic brain injury patients. And so this was under the patient category, but you could also think about that under the hospital category or under the physician category, or even a different set of patients. So you can get more patients in from the waiting room. They're not waiting as long. The ED physicians can see more patients throughout their shift and get them the right disposition sooner. The second example from New Zealand is an example of reducing costs for length of stay. So length of stay can be measured in days, also cost to the organization, cost to the payers, number of patients waiting to be transferred in that can get to the right level of care. So thinking these things through in the beginning of defining a project where lab can contribute, but the actionable data may be outside of the lab can be very powerful. The last piece under the define and deliver data aspect is amplifying the voice of the customer. We have many customers. They have many stories to tell us. We have many stories to tell them. And we need to get those in front of the right people. So we want to hear from our stakeholders, hear from our customers and those patients, and go share those stories in a variety of different places. So think about if you have a good project and had great outcomes, can you share it at grand rounds in your organization? Can you pull together a group of the community endocrinologists to go talk to them about the outcomes? Can you go to a community event where you're actually talking to patients or talking to donors about your story to try to get the word spread for the great work, the lab-enabled work that you are doing? I think the other piece here is this really pays forward, that amplifying the voice of the customer, sharing your successes, kind of puts cash in the bank for when you're looking for resources and input for your next project. So what have you successfully done? What have you successfully partnered to do and accomplish in your organization? So the last ignition tactic here is one of my favorites, actually. It's all labs are local. And so we really need to think about this. So we've talked here about the fabulous global impact of the UNIVANTS program. We've got submissions, we've got winners from all over, and that is truly amazing. So we're truly a global laboratory community. But we act locally as well. And so we need to think about that, what that means. So who is your lab serving? Who are you working for? So the first example here is, again, from a 2022 top winner in Malaysia, the program ROSE. So this was a group who looked at their community and saw that they were having insufficient uptake of cervical cancer diagnostic testing, so Pap smears. So across the globe, this is not a controversial guideline. This is a well-established test to detect cervical cancer. Yet it wasn't being taken up in that population, and so they were still seeing high rates of cervical cancer. So when they dug into what was impacting their community, what were the barriers to those patients and community members coming in to be seen, that they didn't want to have the doctor's visit. They felt it was uncomfortable. It was not, it was not something that they wanted to do. So thinking, again, creatively out of the box, they promoted self-sampling for HPV testing and got more uptake of testing and thus increased diagnosis of cervical cancer. So in a different locale, you may be debating and discussing primary HPV testing versus co-testing versus others, but when you apply it and think about your area, you need to find the right solution that works for your locale and achieves the goals you're aiming to do. So the last two, talking about thinking about all labs are local, you have opportunity to improve health equity. And so two examples here, one both from the US, one from South Carolina. Notice that with the lack of objective biomarker-guided algorithms, they were having a racial disparity in patients getting referred for clinic visits. And so as they implemented a governed, guideline approached objective biomarker algorithm in there that was applied to all comers of patients coming to their clinic, that they had an increase in clinic visits in the particular Black and African American population. Another example from Washington University, and this study was featured in one of the CLN dailies here, as well as a few other sources, is looking at how drug testing or questions that lead to drug testing were applied to all populations for their labor and delivery group and their OB patient population. They found that the lack of structure or the way that those were in place were leading to a disparate referral of Black mothers to the Child and Family Services there. By thinking back from the start of how do patients enter the system, how do patients get drug testing, are we applying the same criteria across the board, they were able to truly impact the social constructs for those patients. So these two, again, you have to think creatively about your local culture, where governed processes may actually improve or decrease implicit bias or health disparities, and get creative about your exploration there. So these are the key takeaways from here that I want to leave you all with. So we want you to activate those best practices. So please keep doing work in cardiology and infectious diseases and so forth, but think about how you can apply these to a broader set of areas. Optimize processes for existing tests. So where do you wish that people were, well, I know this is right, why aren't we seeing it done? Think about how you might optimize those processes. Engage your partners broadly. Just really think that through, pull in everybody you can, get those teams there. Make outcomes data a routine part of your processes and commit to delivering it from the start. You're gonna wanna do all the data, but pick the data that you can do and that will help demonstrate and measure your outcomes. And then recognize the importance of local and cultural factors in enabling equitable care delivery. So with that, I hope I've inspired you. I hope Trish and others have inspired you. We want to leave you with the thought of what are you going to do next in this realm in your location. So I'm going to welcome Pete and Tricia back out here, and we'll have some time for Q&A. So thank you so much.
Okay, well, thank you. First, thank you, Tricia and Christine. That was a fantastic, electric talks. And I'd like to also thank the audience. We're getting some great questions in here, and we actually have ample time to discuss that. I would encourage others to add in questions as you think of it, as you hear the responses. And again, we want this as engaging as possible. So first two questions. So the first question to Tricia. What are some major weaknesses in applications for the UNIVANTS program? And has this been a consistent theme?
Okay, I'll take that. Major weaknesses. I guess what I would say, I think when we talk about weaknesses or opportunities, I like to look at weaknesses as opportunities. I'd say a huge piece is evidence-based key performance indicators. So I think the hardest challenge when it comes to achieving a best practice that gets recognized through the judges is making sure you have the minimum criteria. And I think a piece of that is, one, knowing what to measure, two, proper classification. So when you have a key performance indicator, the question is, who is the beneficiary, right? So if you have an earlier diagnosis, that's a patient as a beneficiary, not the clinician. And so I think mapping stakeholders is important. It's usually not something that gets something excluded, but certainly there is opportunity where KPIs, as they get reviewed, can be excluded. And if enough KPIs get excluded for any given case due to a mismatch or something like that, then recognition isn't possible.
That's great. And usually I would ask Christine to comment, but there's actually a really great question for Christine. So I'm going to ask her to answer this question.
Oh boy.
Okay, so here we go. For those who are considering undertaking a project that could lead to a Univants recognition, what would you say is the most important first step? And then, sorry, they also wrote, what's the second step? Okay, she can't do your application for you, but maybe that's the third step is get Christine on your team, but okay.
Always happy to have partners. No, and I think it's part of what I shared. The best first step is finding that partner outside of the lab, and whether it's a physician, whether it's a pharmacist, whether it's somebody in revenue cycle, whether it's somebody whoever you care about, that they are as excited or as passionate about the question, the project, the potential to impact patients as you are. We all, and I can imagine many of this room, and I alluded to it there, we have spent time thinking of like, oh, I've got this great idea, I really want to implement it, and you go searching for the partners, and you can't quite find it. And so you've got to be open to that sweet spot and not get wedded to, I've got to get this one passion project of mine done. We influence so much for patients in our hospitals, so find the one that can be successful. Find that partner, or partner or two, that can push things across the finish line.
Yeah, I think that's fantastic. So as a bad moderator, you have those words you say and it sounds different. Anyways, moderator, I'm bad. I'm going to make it's not a question, it's a statement. And the statement is as follows. The connection between laboratory medicine and patients is now evidence-based. How great. So let's thank Univants for that. That's great.
Thank all of you.
Because that's not a question, that's a statement, right after hearing that. And then if I was to turn the polls around, I'd like to ask you guys now, we never thought about this, but now after hearing the session, has that 70% dropped? And we more like 70% more aware of Univants. So, well, yeah, I mean, I never thought of that till now. But anyhow, okay. So we're gonna actually delve into some geographical location specific questions. And Tricia, this one would be for you. How can the Univants encourage and improve the healthcare and lab medicine best practices in APAC, particularly India?
Okay. How can we improve best practices?
That's right, yeah.
Okay. So there's, Univants as a platform is designed to bring awareness to best practices that are happening all over the world, whether it's an emerging market, whether it's established market. And so there's opportunities, and the core principle of Univants is to elevate best practices that may not have the voice or may not have the amplification or the megaphone in order to make people more aware of them. So I think irrespective of India or otherwise, I think it's extremely important to be aware of what exists because I think that's the opportunity, right? It's almost a misnomer. Some people think, oh, I have an idea, but it's already been recognized. And the reality is amplification of existing best practices is one of the areas that we want to pursue and we want to amplify. It's why actually complexity of the best practices, the simpler actually, the higher the score. Mm-hmm. That being said, we have also seen that as it gets to specific regions of the world, what we've seen is that the more awareness there is of the program, the more applications we receive for the program. So I only mention that to say that, India is a perfect example. Like the very first year, we actually had a measurable best practice in India. And actually, I think there's a site in India that has had, it's one of the first times to have a 2-time award-winning site, which is quite rare. So I think best practices are happening in India. I don't think, you see it's happening across 32 countries. And I think, which ones geographically are more, I don't know if it's always just about geographics. I do think payment models and things change, but I do think education is important. And I think segregation of the best practices through what people's care abouts are relative to what existing ones exist actually can help amplify, replication in India as well.
Well, that's very thorough. I'll say very complete, so that's great. So now I have another question, and this one's for Christine. How do you recommend lab leaders navigate organizational silos? Oh, like stand up who wrote that one, that's just fantastic. to build stronger visibility and partnerships with administrative and operational leaders. Like that is, Christine?
Sure. So that is key, and it's funny, as Pete was introducing me, checking his AI, I have to update our website because a lot of the information for my roles and goals were not up there. And so I spent a lot of my time working with our hospital administration, the different department leaders, but also thinking about how not just me as a leader, but our managers can partner with their partner in the ED. Our medical directors in chemistry could partner with the endocrinologists very directly. And so I think it's establishing those relationships in the day-to-day, and it's not just going to them when you have a project idea, but it's that every day, that being there to interpret a case for them, sharing a new guideline with them, like, hey, have you seen this? Or being receptive to them sending something to you. And then I think working with I don't know who all is laboratory administrators out here, things like that, but again, working with the hospital operation partners to always be on the radar, to be advocating for what you're doing. So the groundwork is laid in the day-to-day, and then that comes when you're coming to call to like, hey, I've got a big project I want to do. You already have those partners, you already have those people, or they can connect you with somebody that you haven't worked with yet to say, hey, this is a vetted person, this is a vetted team, let's connect them, and I think you guys are going to do good work together.
Yeah, I think that's fantastic advice, and I think overall that will lead to probably better work relationships, and among other things, right? So maybe everyone should be applying to UNIVANTs. Okay,
Peter,
so...
is it okay if I add something?
Okay, Tricia, go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I just think as a whole, we need to be comfortable in the unknown, right? So much of what lab medicine does is provide answers, right? And that's test results and so forth. And so we're seen as experts, and we always feel we need to have the answers, and sometimes because maybe we're undervalued for some of the work that gets done behind the scenes, it can be difficult to play in that space where you're brainstorming where you don't have the answer. Mm-hmm. And the whole point about getting a seat at the table is acknowledging the fact that when you're trying to solve something that's larger than any lab medicine problem, like health system workflow, often lab medicine doesn't have that seat. Mm-hmm. And I think, the opportunity for us is to be comfortable in the unknown, right? To be able to sit at that table without A, having the answer that minute, or B, being able to brainstorm, because I think, especially when we talk about emergency flow turnover, a lot of times housekeeping may have that seat at the table, because if they're able to turn a bed over super fast, but lab medicine may have an opportunity, whether that's a new biomarker or a new process, to actually improve workflow in the emergency medicine department that's going to far exceed any benefit that you might have out of the other stakeholder. They're just not there to discuss that. And I think that sometimes takes patience, right? Because we have to be willing to sit at a table where we may not have something to contribute, depending on what the topic is, but then also be comfortable knowing that, there's a role for lab medicine at that table, and if we're not inviting ourselves, or if we're not being invited to the table, to be inviting yourself to that table.
Well, that's great. So the polling question was like, should I have asked Tricia to comment on that? And the correct answer would have been yes. So that's fantastic. I think that's, so now I have a couple, I really appreciate, to all you in the audience, thanks for sticking around. Thanks for the questions. You're really making actually my job very, very easy. In fact, it's getting difficult because there's so many great questions. But I'm going to pick ones that have been already assigned to people, so thank you for doing that. Okay, so Christine, I got to do that. Okay, so what was the most unexpected lesson you learned, personally or professionally, from leading your team through this initiative?
Ooh. So I echo a little bit of Tricia's point about patience. And so what I didn't share there was the attempts we made to put a test out there initially that we thought was good, to the attempts that were made to get a seat at the table early on. And so patience is really important. The other thing, and this is a subtle lesson that I've applied to other things, is you have to get in the brain of people outside of the lab. And from ours, the key lesson to me in our project was so simple. And I do have to call my coworker, Jamie Noguez is out in the audience, who was a team member on this project as well, is that when we created this new test, we wanted to tell them how to use this big panel test versus the regular drug screen versus the other. And so we had an educational document that said, here's this test, order it in this circumstance. Here's this test, order it in this circumstance. But that's not how patients come in. And so the simple flip of getting into the mind of the clinician, they have a patient coming in who's on a drug. What do they need to order? So we flipped our education and said, this is what's prescribed, so you should order this. And that lesson in that project has helped me form those relationships through COVID, through other things, and thinking through what is important to the stakeholders outside of the lab, whether it's physicians, whether it's patients, whether it's hospital operators getting into their head, everything, but thinking through what do they need, what speaks to them, and not coming just from the lab perspective. Bring our expertise, but customize it in a way that those other parties need.
Yeah, I mean, I could add a comment, but it would be very low value, and we're only talking about high value comments. Okay, so here's the next question, and this is open to anyone on this panel except for myself. How do you know what KPIs to measure for each stakeholder in the application criteria?
You want to take that one? Go ahead. Go ahead.
Oh, have you stumped them? That's a great question. So someone's
No, it's just it's a tough question because I think probably I would say, part of the challenge that I see is that sometimes people get to the end of something good and they say, how can we show we were good? And the reality is they don't have the baseline data. Mm-hmm. And if you don't have baseline data, you can't show a measurable change. Often we get questions or even comments, where it's like, well, I'm not the best of the best, so I could not possibly win an award. And the reality is what we're measuring, or what we're actually quantifying, what the judges are looking for, is a measurable impact. There's a measurable difference. So it doesn't mean that you're the best and the best and that you have to hit a certain bar. It simply means that you have to have a measurable change. So I think the first piece is, as we embark on projects, one is, what does success look like? Even what does interim success look like? Because we all know we have to pivot. And how are we going to measure that? And I think, it's funny, we had a case once where they looked at, they were changing a patient report. It was a reference lab, and they did ask the question, were you happy, to a physician? Do you like our report? But the answer of do you like a report isn't clinical satisfaction, right? It's like, yes, I like your report. And so, whether or not that new information actually facilitated faster triage, made things easier, and what have you, I think part of it is understanding how are you going to measure success when you embark on the project, getting some type of baseline assessment, or if it's a qualitative assessment, how are you going to measure that value, and then understand that as the progress progresses. But I think often people wait to the end, they realize they hit gold because they've done something amazing, and they don't know how to measure that quantitative impact. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I'm just going to try to get through a couple other ones that are really intriguing. Figuring what to measure can be hard. So that's a good laboratory professional. Stand up and take a bow, because that's what we struggle with every day. But in regards to Univants, can you share what metrics impress the judges the most? So either Christine, Tricia, can you tell us what they're looking for or impresses them the most?
Yeah.
It could be trade secrets you can't say, that's fine too.
So it's hard to say, because I'm not as deeply and historically involved as Tricia has been, but I find myself impressed by quantitative measures, and those are the hardest to do. As Tricia said, you've got to plan in advance, you've got to get your baseline data and know what you're measuring. And so I think those quantitative measures do have impact. Quantitative measures outside of some of the financials and things like that. So getting to those quantitative measures with clinicians, getting to quantitative measures with patients. I do find that those are more impactful, but they're also the hardest to get. Well-designed surveys that go beyond just the, are you satisfied or not satisfied? And I think this is principles of surveys in general. And so, designing your survey to get a, meaningful response. So, how did this impact your practice? What exactly of, weight the change, of weight the impact, or things like that. So those are some of the thoughts I have.
I'll answer that too, is it okay?
Of course.
Okay, yeah. Thank you, Christina. I think that was great. And it brought up two thoughts in my head. First and foremost, to the survey question, try not to make them binary. Yes, no. Try not to lead the question. Those are kind of areas where I think we'll separate kind of like, some of the lower ranks to the higher ranks. The other thing I will say is, the way I would assess impact is, for every quant or qual that gets submitted, there's also a kind of high, medium, or low kind of impact, if you will, so a multiplier against the KPI. And so quantitatives by nature already start at a higher baseline, and then impactful ones then get multiplied by that higher baseline. So sometimes I would say don't underestimate, and there's no doubt the reason why we've minimized the total number of quals is because we can get submissions and have where there's tons of quals. And really this is designed, the quals are designed when you can't have a hard measure. So if you do submit something like length of stay and it's not quantitative, chances are it will be excluded because that's a quantitative measure that we should measure. It's not a subjective thing. But where was I headed with this? I wanted to highlight the fact that, oh my gosh, I totally lost my train of thought and it was good. But I guess what I wanted to say was, oh well, I forget. Let's just move on.
It was captured. Yeah.
So we are running out of time. There are great actual questions still remaining. I do apologize. I've done my best to actually address them all. But of course, as a bad moderator, I can't get to them all. So you can put that bad mark for me. But I do want to remind individuals of the accent credits, very important. And again, it's 1.5 you can have. And I just want to ask any final thoughts to Christine or Tricia you want to impart on this prestigious and insightful audience who asked such great questions.
So we go. Oh, so yeah, it's really things I've said before. It's get outside of the lab, both physically, relationship connections, and mentally outside of the lab. So find those partners. There's strength in numbers. There's power in working together with people. And so just look for those opportunities to bring your expertise and connect with somebody else to have impact.
Okay, I remember what I was going to say.
Sorry, time is up.
No, let me get it out before, and then I'll do my piney thoughts. Is if you do have a qualitative, don't underestimate its power, because I have seen judges give the highest impact to a qualitative quote if it's related to patient, and certainly if you have metrics related to mortality and some of the really key, they also come off as high. As for parting comments, I'd just like to say. That I think the future of lab medicine is super bright. I mean, I couldn't be more excited, right? We have the data and the insights, particularly as we start thinking through how we're going to transform healthcare delivery today. And Univants is just one platform for that to be accelerated. But I think it's really exciting, and I really wish and hope that anyone in the audience, particularly the 70% that didn't know anything about the program, that if you do have a best practice and you're interested in getting it amplified through the program, submit your best practice. Or if you have questions, go to the helpline, right? Because there's a lot of tools on the helpline. But the new cycle starts August 1st, which is like Friday. And so we'd love to have applications from the 70% that's probably doing best practices, but didn't know that they could be recognized for that work.
Okay, so with that, let's give a big round of applause to Tricia and Christine. And keep on clapping because you in the audience made this all worthwhile, right? Good questions. Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your evening.
All right.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.